Bob Solomon, and I'm honored to be sitting next to Bradley Horowitz. I had the great fortune of working with Bradley at Yahoo back in the 2004 to 2008 time period. And what's unique about Bradley is he's a lot like a fine wine. He just gets better and better with age, and you'll learn about that in a minute. But what's really unique about Bradley is he's been sitting at the bleeding edge of product development at two of the most important internet companies in the history of the internet. And we'll talk a lot about how data and big data specifically drives culture, product development, and a lot of the products that people use around the globe. So why don't we start off by talking about the special culture that Google has, and we've all heard a lot about this, but data drives the culture. And if you really think about that, what the hell does that mean? I think we have the best person in the world to tell us exactly how data drives the culture, so Bradley's going to start with that, and we'll keep moving into how data has been shaping Google and product development.
Yeah, thank you. It really was a pleasure working at Yahoo with you, and it's actually great to see all the great things that Yahoos have gone on to do and have mini reunions anytime there's a gathering like this. But it was a very interesting transition moving from Yahoo's culture and their approach toward product management and data and flipping into Google's culture. First of all, Yahoo was a great company, is a great company. I had a fantastic experience there. I learned a tremendous amount. I met some people who are friends for life and taught me so much. And yet, being at Yahoo, there was a tremendous fascination with Google. That was a hell of a company to compete against. And it was almost irresistible when I did have the chance to get inside of Google. Part of me wanted to go there to just sort of peek behind the curtain, to see what was really going on there, because the myth of the place and the sort of rhetoric of the place was so epic and legendary, you sort of wanted to debunk that and sort of see exactly what was going on. And so it was one of the reasons I decided at that point in my life that I was ready to continue in an operating role and take on another challenge. And when I got to Google, it was a fascinating experience. It is exactly what it seems. I mean, sort of no more, no less, which was the biggest surprise of all, because I sort of went there with this intention of, debunking it and found it was absolutely transparent. Everything you had heard was true and more. And by that, I mean, I think the approach toward Google, something as mundane as hiring, speaks to the reliance on data and the way that they think about things. But we try to get the best people in the world, and we have a process, and I'll talk a little bit about that process. And then the next phase of being a noogler, which is this new Googler that we sort of onboard, is to become dyed in the philosophies of the company, to really start to imbibe the way that Google thinks about problems, the way that our infrastructure works, the way that the organization adapts to take on innovation and new challenges. And sort of you sort of get that through osmosis. You get it by getting thrown in the deep end of the pool. And then mostly, once you're sort of part of the family and steeped in the traditions and the values of Google, they sort of trust that the right things will happen. So it's a tremendously brave approach and an empowering approach towards management, but really strange to come into as an executive at Yahoo and then step into Google and realize that the way you lead at Google is very different. And it's been fascinating. Now, to reflect back at Yahoo and the days of data at Yahoo, we had an incredible team of data scientists under Usama Fayyad, and we had a data services division. And the philosophy around that was they would look at logs and mine data and sort of reflect back value to the business units and sort of hand back opportunity to them. That very structure and that very approach is really antithetical to the way that Google thinks about data. We don't sort of relegate our data problems to another division of the company. Data is part and parcel of what products are, what products do, and the design of the product and the iterations that we make on the product. So as opposed to having a service bureau, data science is embedded in each of the teams, and not even explicitly. There's not a part of the team that deals with data. we all deal with data. We all embrace data as part of what it means to build a great product. So to speak a little bit about this data-driven culture, it starts with the hiring, which I think is a really bizarre experience to come in as a vice president to Google and realize I couldn't hire an admin. You know, I literally could not say, this person worked for me, I know that he's great, I'd like to hire him. All I could do was sort of nominate him through the hiring pipeline. And the hiring pipeline is designed to get rid of things like cronyism, nepotism, and false positives. And so what happens is these candidates get a random interview from a qualified group of Googlers who are well calibrated to the way that we hire and the way that we do things. And the decision to hire or not hire sort of pops out the other end with very little say from the hiring manager. I can sort of make a case and I can sort of speak to my experience. That's not ignored, but it is not the determining factor in whether someone is hired. And that goes from a lowest level admin to a chief scientist. Everyone sort of has to walk that gauntlet. And it has benefits and was designed with, very deliberately. And it's maddening sometimes because there are people who I know are great that will never be hired by Google, but it also has the consequence that when I go into work on a Monday morning, I know that everyone there is, smarter than me and has something to teach me. So we have very few false positives. Everyone there is really fantastically great. And it's one of the sort of examples of the way that the culture relies on data to do things that other companies would do in a very ad hoc or from the gut kind of fashion.
Got it. So it sounds like before big data was a buzz term, Google's entire foundation was built upon this notion of big data. So today, we're seeing about 2.5 quintillion bytes of data being created. 90% of the data that exists was created in the past 2 years. So this explosion of data is blessing and curse. Talk about how this special culture that Google has created then translates into these special products, and what specifically does data play in the creation of the things that millions of people around the globe are using on a daily basis?
Right. Well, I do think big data, there's a lot of focus on that today. I think rolling back 15 years ago when Larry and Sergey were here, they really are visionaries. If you look at PageRank, the fundamental algorithm, it is a data-driven algorithm. As opposed to using the tools of information retrieval, which look at the semantic nature of content, they were looking at link flux and basically saying, let's make this problem about crowdsourcing relevance and understanding that webmasters can confer value to other links by linking to them. And that in itself is a data-driven approach towards solving a problem that heretofore was done in a much more rules-based ad hoc sort of manner. It was much more around pattern matching. So this is something that goes back to Google's roots. Even pre-Google, Larry and Sergey were sort of steeped in this. I think in terms of how it continues to inform product development, I think, rolling back to even Yahoo and the days of Flickr, there are opportunities to create derivative products around data that I think are often missed. So Flickr ostensibly is a photo sharing service. People are uploading content and snapping photos. But attached to those photos is a tremendous amount of metadata. And in fact, you could argue that the value is really more around the metadata than it is the actual pixels in the image in terms of quantity of data. That's the sort of cream, the most valuable parts. One of the things the Flickr team did was analyze when photos were taken and where photos are taken, and they could build heat maps of places like San Francisco that revealed huge important trends, like at night, people were out at bars, and in the day, people were in work, and you could actually see this as an ebb and flow on the diurnal patterns of people taking photos as they moved from work activities to leisure activities. All of that was sort of locked up in the data, and not immediately evident that a photo sharing service would be able to sort of unearth that kind of value. But those are the kinds of surprising contributions that data can make. And I think the key is to, as you're developing a product to think about what are those missed opportunities? Where is there hidden gems laying in the data that you can mine and exact as value and then return that value to users?
Right. So how do you take something like maps, which is basically bits and bytes of latitude, longitude, and then related places of interest. How do you go from that to self-driving cars, and what is the role that data plays in a fantastical product like that?
So I'm not particularly close to either of those products. I've never worked on self-driving cars, and I'm a huge user and fan of Google Maps, and to a degree, they inform a lot of what Google does across our products. But watching the way that those two teams interact is fascinating. I think that there's obviously navigation. So part of the promise of self-driving cars is that you no longer have to worry about getting from point A to point B. You don't have to do the tedious punch in all the stuff, have some automated robot talking to you. The navigation just happens. You sort of surrender to the navigation and you sort of arrive at your destination, and the cognitive load of sort of managing the process of getting from point A to point B is returned to you, and you can use that for something productive during that time. So there's a very obvious opportunity there. And what else, I'm sure everyone here has used Google Maps to navigate, is that it's dynamic. It's based on real-time data, so it's not only around historical records that we know Monday morning there's a lot of traffic on 101, you might want to route on 280, but it's real-time. If there's an accident that changes the typical flow, that can be communicated. You can route around these things.
Right.
And moreover, again, it's not dependent on a static set of sensors. Every single person navigating is themselves a contributor back to there. So if I'm stuck at a light and I stay there for 3 minutes as the cops are clearing the accident off, that information can be aggregated and made available to improve the person who's 2 miles behind me, their experience. So I think as you think about these things holistically, Maps isn't an end in itself. It's in service of these applications that will help people live better lives, help people find more time to do the things that are important to them. And it's a great example, because I think Maps really is a platform. It's not just a product. It's a great product, but it's also a platform that we can use to return lots of value to users in different ways.
Awesome. So when you think about product development and its evolution over the last decade, in the old days, it was launch, iterate, make the product better, get some user feedback. Today, you have so much data to help inform the decision. Can you talk about the pros and cons of data-driven product development versus, I guess, iterative, gut-like product development?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think, to cut to the chase, the answer is you need to do both. In certain cases, it is very important to have an experimental framework that allows you to test hypotheses and understand that your gut or what is patently obvious to you can be wrong. And you will be humbled many times by the data. And eventually you learn to rely on the data as a means. And I can't tell you how many meetings I sit in where we're discussing 3 options, and inevitably the right answer is let's use data to inform the decision. Let's actually launch them in experiments and come back, and often the results are really surprising. Sometimes we can sort of infer reasoning behind them and sort of support the outcome with an insight that allows us to understand. Other times we don't care. It's actually not that important that we sort of tease out the underlying principle. This works better, we're going with this. And I think that this process is really important. I think that most startups have sort of discovered this. I think one of the advantages of Google is scale, that you can actually have statistically meaningful samples, and we can run experiments at scale across regions, across demographics, and really benefit from the scale that Google operates in. But to your question, I think that there is sort of a local maxima effect that iterate and refine brings you. You can sort of tweak something ad nauseum and get to a point where it's optimized and you can't further progress through tweaks and experiments. And it's in those cases that I think you need true insight, true innovation, the ability to leapfrog what is in market or the sort of optimized, finely tuned system, and do something that's wild and completely different. You know, Google Glass did not come through an iteration, you know, of my optical glasses where, you know, first we strapped on a battery and then we strapped on a camera, you know. Yeah. This was an insight. This was a theory and a thesis. And as projects mature, they'll sort of go from that more intuitive sense to a more optimized sense of how the product development happens. But I think there is a risk of reaching these local maxima and sort of stagnating. And so it's always important to reset and ask, are we testing the right things? Are we approaching the problem in the right way? Is there another way to solve the same problem which is completely different, which we'll never get through a local optimization?
Got it. That's great. So if you think about these things and the explosion of data that comes with them and the real-time nature of these devices, what implications does that have on product development, on the enterprise in and of itself? You know, real-time data and explosion. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? A little of both?
I think it's a huge opportunity, and I think there's a couple things about it. First of all, there's so many sensors packed in here. And again, this isn't immediately obvious. I think when people think of mobile, often they think of the form factor and, you know, the ubiquitous nature. The best camera in the world is the one that's with you. And, you know, these are all true. And they're very important when designing for form factors like this. But also present here are these amazing sensors. You've got microphones, you've got accelerometers, you've got GPS, you've got Wi-Fi, you've got Bluetooth, you've got these things which are both sensors and means of sharing and conveying information. And I think they represent a huge opportunity to create much more innovation and do very, very interesting things. And I think we're just starting as an industry to think about these things not simply as, you know, smaller devices, more portable devices, but what are the really breakthrough applications that these sensors will allow. And I think increasingly we're not done. You know, there are further sensors that will be integrated. You hear rumors of some of these, and they can provide immense value. I use the Flickr example of, you know, nobody thought they were sort of volunteering information that would create a heat map of San Francisco nightlife. But that was an artifact of the fact that these are sensor-rich environments, and these sensors in real time can provide a ton of value to build applications like that. So I think we're just getting started. You know, we have these on the table. We have 4 devices here. I would say there's probably more sensors in this room than there are people in this room, right? There's probably multiple phones on some of you. I think there's probably very few people who don't have a phone or a tablet or a computer with them right now. And so thinking about how that array, and if you actually think about it, it is an array of sensors, can be used to create applications is a really fun thought experiment. And a Google-like experiment. It would actually be fun to, you know, in the second half of this conference, cancel everything and have a workshop that basically said, we have an array of sensors here. What could we do with that would be interesting? And, you know, off the top of my head, you could think about directionality, right? When people are speaking or events happen, and there's applications that do gunshot geolocation based on microphone sensors, right? You can think of things when you think about an array of sensors over the world, there's interesting applications that spill out of that aren't immediately obvious. And I think that's one of the big opportunities in terms of product development is to note these trends that you're identifying and then think about what are the non-intuitive but hugely valuable accidental products that we can build. And I think we're just starting to see an explosion of these.
So thinking about accidental products, I think before you came to Yahoo, none of us had ever heard of a hackathon. So Bradley brought the concept of hackathons to Yahoo, which I think then disseminated throughout Silicon Valley. And a lot of great product innovation happens through these spur-of-the-moment hack-like events. How do you think about that versus, you know, pure data-driven productization? If you know, do you lose creativity in that data-driven approach versus the hack approach?
That is a really great question. And I think one of the values of hack days or hackathons or 20% time, I think there's different ways to achieve the same goal, is to sort of get out of these local maxima, you know, to give you an opportunity to completely rethink the problem, for you to think outside of your domain. That's another thing about the Google culture that I really appreciate, is there's a ton of fluidity. It's very unlikely that anyone will work on the same problem over a career at Google. I was hired in and worked on Gmail and Docs and products that I'm no longer involved with. And it gives me a huge understanding of those products and the sensitivities of those products. I took with me a lot of learnings, and that sort of cycling is par for the course. And it's one of the reasons why we tend to hire generalists at Google, people who are going to be fruitful and working on the problems of 10 years from now that we can't even anticipate. We don't know what that skill set is, but we know if we hire a generalist who's curious and smart and competent, that it's likely that they'll be able to contribute when that time comes along. So I think it's a balance between both structured, you know, your 80% time and being able to do a great job on that part, but also creating the space in your company or your life to take these giant steps back to offer up different approaches to the problems and the solutions that we all take for granted.
Great. So if you think about Google, data is a part of the DNA. It's an immutable truth, and nothing gets built without factoring in the impact of data. A lot of companies don't have that luxury. They have to bring data into the organization and then figure out what to do with it. And I'm guessing a lot of companies make huge mistakes in how to leverage the data, how to inform insights from the data. What advice do you have for companies that don't have that native DNA, and what are the pitfalls to avoid, and what are the opportunities that they should take advantage of?
Yeah, well, one thing, I think the cultural aspects of Google are adoptable. Right? These are not trade secret. We have spoken about them, and they're not immediately intuitive, especially as you're a 3-person startup or a 20-person startup, but I think they're really valuable. And fortunately at Google, I had a lot of friends who were at my startup, you know, now getting on 15 plus years ago, Dave Gerard, who ran the enterprise division, and one day Dave pulled me over and sort of confessed, I can't believe how we hired when we were at a startup. It was completely ad hoc. It was completely arbitrary. We didn't have any sort of science behind it. We didn't do the follow-through to actually determine whether or not our hiring decisions were good or bad. Just the normal hygiene around that we take for granted at Google around bringing candidates in, figuring out through this closed-loop process who are good interviewers, which interviewers are predictive of success in the company a year later, things like that. I think these are the things culturally that even small companies can do to send a message to employees that we're data-driven, that, you know, that we value the contribution of data in our organization. And I think in a lot of ways it starts at that cultural level and then spills over into the product and spills over as the company scales. The other thing that Google did was sort of planning for success. And so even as you're a startup, I think you need to assume that you're going to be relevant, that you're going to be at scale eventually, and set up your processes and set up the company and its approach toward data, assuming that that's going to happen. And I think otherwise it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that you sort of capitate the success scenarios if you're not planning for best case.
Got it. Let's play some word association. So if you put your data cap on, let's throw out some of the big buzz terms that everyone hears a lot of. Cloud.
I think for us at Google, it's not a term that's bandied about that much. It's been so much part of the company and their approach toward solving problems that we don't think of our cloud solution. I do think devices, like I've got the Chrome OS Pixel here, begin to blow your mind. You know, like there was a conversation I had with Sundar, who leads that team, and this is going back years ago, where we were talking about cloud and drive and local files and things like that. And he really saw that files in some ways are artifacts of a historical method of doing things. Eventually, we move to a world without files per se. They're still objects, but those objects are cloud resident, and they're not manifest on a drive or in any particular place. And I think if you begin to use the Pixel, for instance, it's a no compromises device. You can use that and do everything you need to do throughout your workday generally faster than a workflow that involves files and the traditional ways of doing this. So I think the switch to mobile, the switch to tablet, and the switch to Chrome OS and these true cloud-based devices, cloud-based operating systems, are driving sort of an internalization of what cloud means. And that's exciting. And I think, the problems around what happens when I'm in a tunnel, what happens when I'm in a bunker, what happens when I'm on a plane, remain challenges for the industry to solve. But increasingly, planes have Wi-Fi too, and I think that these are tractable problems that we're actually making headway on.
Okay. Mobile, specifically Android.
It's just amazing what that team has accomplished, and I was at Google long enough ago to see the first generations of Android phones, and it's actually really inspiring to see what persistence and time and sensitivity to data and feedback and generations can bring. It's actually a very small amount of time between that first G1, which I think most people would refer to as a brick now, both in form factor and sort of functionality, versus the phones that are shipping today. Like, I've got a Galaxy Note 2 here, but there's such an array of great mind-blowing phones, you can no longer keep up with the innovation on Android. It's an amazing accomplishment that, again, credit to Andy, Larry, Sergey, and the team that built this franchise, because it wasn't immediately obvious with those first generations of phones that we were going to get there. So I've been an incredibly happy customer and a huge internal fan of that. It's just an amazing team that built that product. It's not an accidental success. It's the result of a lot of hard work and a lot of skill and craft over years.
And as you think about the future of Android and things like Google Glass, so talk a little bit more about data and what the future holds. And I know you're going to be speculating and guessing, and this isn't based on specific products, but how does the world change as the Internet of Things and sensors and always on and always connected mobile occurs?
Yeah, so I'm really fascinated by Glass. I've been a Glass user. I'm not wearing a pair right now, and I've had them on literally minutes. It's not like I've been dogfooding this and can speak with authority around Glass. But what I think is so fascinating about Glass are, again, the derivative applications. I am wearing a jawbone up, right? And so the quantified self movement, the ability to sort of capture data and offer it back to users for their own benefit, I think is a theme for the industry. An example of something I think is interesting with Glass, this is sort of another unexpected possibility, and again, I'm not on the Glass team, and this is not something, as far as I know, that is under development, but just the kind of thought experiment that any of us can run. You can imagine that at Shoreline Amphitheater 2 years from now, there's a concert and some fraction of the audience, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 10%, actually has Google Glass or maybe a Google Glass-like device on. Imagine that at 10:31, U2 takes the stage. What's going to happen at that moment is everyone's head's going to turn. Suddenly, what was a bunch of people talking to each other and a bunch of people engaged in their phones or otherwise, meandering, are going to focus their attention in the same place, in the same direction, at the same moment in time. So you've actually got this tremendous idea, just that gesture of sort of turning your head and the accelerometer that may be in that device, and the ability to aggregate that across large numbers of people can sort of pin that moment of time as a moment of interest. And so you've got this sort of ability to gang those devices together. Another example would be, imagine that at the Eiffel Tower, you could actually, we do a lot of eye tracking studies in the user experience field. Imagine that there were an imaginary, this is imaginary, an imaginary vector shooting out of Google Glass that was painting objects in the world with your attention. As I move my head and as I look at objects in the world, you could imagine applying a vote with that imaginary vector coming out of the glass. You would look at something like the Eiffel Tower, and it's rich in attention. It's been painted with people's attention many, many times. But if you go into some back alley and you open a trash can lid, you might be the first person sort of viewing that, you know? So glass, in an indirect way, could paint an attention map of objects in the world, where some, the Mona Lisa, would be a highly valued recipient of attention, and other things wouldn't. And that in itself is an asset that you could imagine mining for the benefit of humanity, right? If you think about things like Street View, you could go on safaris where you find things that are not well covered and you contribute photos to help map the world. You could also realize that as you're staring at the Mona Lisa, I probably don't need to take that picture. It's been taken, 4 million times, and I could actually composite a picture from the pixels already contributed better than the optics of my camera could create. So you could actually do synthetic photography and actually get a picture that is, bringing together the contributions of other people in the same place before. So again, these are not active projects on the Glass team. I think they're dealing with other sort of first order issues around making that device awesome. But as you look out years in the future, these are the sort of things that big data allows you to do when you have the sort of market penetration and opportunity to allow people to contribute to this commons of data and use each other's data in service.
Fascinating. If you think about your tenure on the internet developing products and go back to Virage, the video company that you founded, and you think about video now and the relationship between video and data, and the old days we talked about 500 channels, now it's probably 5 billion channels. Riff on that a little bit. I mean, you've seen an incredible evolution from your early days in product development with video to what's happening now.
Yep.
What do you think about that a little bit?
Talk about that a little bit. One of the lessons for me with Virage is we were way too early. And I don't mean that as a compliment. That was a YouTube 7.0 product before the world was ready for YouTube 1.0. And there was a whole bunch of first order problems around making that click reliable and buffering and intellectual property. There were a whole bunch of things that needed to be solved before the technology we were working on became relevant. But I appreciate the question because the core insight that we had at Virage was that metadata trumps data. And what we did with video was we exacted metadata from the video. We used all means possible, from closed caption extraction to optical character recognition, scene segmentation, speech recognition, and this is back in the 90s that we were doing this, to turn video from this opaque bucket of bits into highly indexed content that you could then repurpose and stitch together in various ways. And that was all dependent on capturing metadata. The irony about video is that, in general, it was a process of throwing that data away and going through extreme pains to regenerate it. Generally, most video that is created, or at least professional quality video that we were dealing with in the 90s, there was a newscaster reading from a teleprompter, but what he was reading was not married back to the video, so someone had to manually enter closed captioning, or we had to do speech recognition to recreate the data that was lost. And so one of the themes of my career, and one thing I firmly believe, as I'm excited about these sensors, I think it's important that people have a right to capture their own data. Because the opportunities are not yet well known, and these derivative applications will come later. That's why I'm excited about things like quantified self devices like the Jawbone, is that I'm collecting the data now, and it may be much later that I'm able to run over my data and see trends that might impact my health and might actually show things that a day-to-day assessment of my sleep patterns would miss, that could be real medical concerns and breakthroughs. And so I think, charting the arc of my career, one of the things that I've learned is that data is important, metadata is important, and ultimately, we often don't know that until after the fact. And it's important to give people the tools that allow them to capture this data and use it in their own service. And that was true 20 years ago, and I think it's ever more true today.
So the red light is blinking, so we're just about done. But in closing, so you've had a fascinating career, especially the last decade. You've been at Yahoo and Google and two of the more innovative companies we've ever seen. What do you think about the next 10 years in terms of product development? More exciting, less exciting? How does it evolve?
Oh, absolutely more exciting. I mean, again, I think we're still working out the first order problems around connectivity and identity and spam and the internet does not just work today. And in fact, we have huge teams of people at Google working on dealing with things like latency and the fact when I open my device, why should it take 20 seconds for it to turn on? These are not small inconsequential things. They're sort of prerequisites to getting to the interesting problems. And I think we're now getting to these interesting problems where compute cycles are not free, but they're abundant, and storage is not free, but it's abundant. We sort of have a culture of compute abundance now, and this allows us to come in and actually get creative without concern for the constraints that have sort of limited innovation. So I think the next 10 years, I can't wait. I want to be a part of it, and I'm excited to be alive now because I think we have a lot more opportunity to solve a lot more of the world's problems in the next 10 years than we have just getting up to the plate in the last 10.
Fantastic. So we're just getting warmed up, according to Bradley. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you.
That was great.